Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's 6 p.m., so we will get started for the evening. Hope everyone's doing well and your week is off to a good start. We are in a kind of a strange schedule, as we all know, with this class. And so we actually, after tonight, we only have two more Zoom sessions left. We have a Zoom session next Monday on the 3rd, and then our final one the following Monday on the 10th. So we are very quickly approaching the end of our course time together. Thank you for Canvas number 3. I didn't provide a lot of feedback on those just because I had already provided feedback on your background paper. And I thought providing the same feedback then in the Canvas essay 3 would be a little bit redundant. And so don't be surprised if you don't see any feedback. You just see a 10 out of 10 because I'd already provided the feedback previously on the paper. Canvas essay number 4 is coming due then next Sunday on July 2nd. And for Canvas essay number 4, we're going to use some of the information that we're covering in class tonight on mission statements and the establishment of goals and the impact that mission statements and goals and objectives may have on the effectiveness of public organizations. All you need to do for that Canvas essay is share with me the mission of your organization or a close facsimile thereof, and then also provide for me a couple of the goals of your organization, and then talk about how the issue that you've identified for your background paper, how that issue then has an impact upon the effectiveness of your organization. Chances are how it's inhibiting the effectiveness of your organization. So a very brief Canvas posting. I do understand also that you are coming into crunch time now for 698. I understand that your draft is due, I believe, I was told July 7th, and so that's rolling around very quickly. So I do want to relieve some of the burden from this class on you so that you can focus some of your attention on that 698 deadline that's coming up. So that's why Canvas essay number 5 and number 6, those Canvas essays are not officially due until July 11th. And so giving you some additional time then to work on those and turn those in. You can always turn them in early. And I know some people have already turned in Canvas essay number 5. But Canvas essay number 5 will then look at the models of organizational effectiveness. And in the second part of class tonight, we will get into those 4 models of effectiveness a little bit more than we have up to this point in time. And so the information you need to do Canvas essay 5, you'll get in the second half of class tonight. Then Canvas essay number 6 looks at motivational theories and the impact of motivation on effectiveness in organizations. That is information that we will get to next week. So after next week's session, you'll then have the information you need in order to do Canvas essay number 6. As we discussed in our first week of class, the alternative solutions paper and the chosen solution paper, we have moved those due dates also back to July 11th. You can always turn those papers in early if you would like, and a few people have already turned in the alternative solutions paper, but just to give you a little bit more time to work on 698, we have those due dates then also set for our last day, which is July the 11th. That is a Tuesday. So that's where we are, and that's where we are going in terms of our assignments. Again, for tonight, we're going to look at mission and goals and their impact upon effectiveness. Then the second half of class tonight, we'll talk about the models of organizational effectiveness, those 4 different models, ways in which we can define effectiveness. Then if there is still time remaining tonight, we may then turn our attention to decision-making very quickly and the impact of decision-making on effectiveness. If we don't have time to do that tonight, we can always then extend that discussion at the beginning of class next week. The next week, we'll do motivational theories. And then our final week together, we'll look at leadership, and we'll talk about the impact that leadership has on effectiveness. And then that will round out our term together and all the information we typically cover in this course. All right, sound good? Any questions or anything before we get going for tonight?
I have a question just on the discussion topics. I think I got confused on which one we're on just because of like the holiday last week. But the one that was due yesterday was the mission statement one,
No, the
or
one
is
that
that
was,
due?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah.
know is the one for this upcoming Sunday the mission statement one, or is it the models for?
The one coming up this Sunday will be the mission statement one.
Oh,
for this
okay.
Sunday. Yeah. And
Okay,
then the
awesome.
last two, number 5 and 6, those are not then officially due until July 11th. Mhm. Yeah, I know our
Thank you
schedule's
very
a
much.
little, yeah, our schedule's a little strange, and with the days off, and then it's everything gets compressed, and then with 698 also competing for your time, it's a little odd this term, but yes, you're correct. The mission statement one is due coming up on Sunday.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's go ahead then and jump into our information for tonight. And again, the first half of class tonight, we're going to talk about missions and goals and their impacts upon organizational effectiveness. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with your organization and the stated goals of your organization. Many of you have gone through a strategic planning process within your organization as well, so you're very familiar with how your organization engages in putting together a strategic plan. Well, what we want to do tonight is look at these issues, assuming that you already have a working understanding of these issues, but look at these issues in terms of what they then mean for the effectiveness of our organizations. And we know that we have different types of goals in public and nonprofit organizations. Some of our goals tend to be those long-term goals. We usually refer to those long-term goals as our official goals of our organization. So, the goals that we talk about in our mission statements, those are our official, our long-term types of goals. But then we also know that we have intermediate goals and objectives that we are hoping to accomplish along the way that will then move us down the path toward the accomplishment of our long-term official goals. In the literature, we usually refer to those intermediate goals, and some people call them objectives, as operative goals. So these are the relatively specific intermediate goals that will then help us achieve our ultimate long-term official goals. So two different types of goals. Sometimes we confuse them, and when we confuse them, sometimes it leads to a lot of trouble in strategic planning. But those official goals, those long-term goals, are the ones that flow directly out of our mission statements. And those will really tell everyone who comes into contact with the organization what the organization values, because they're very much predicated on the values of the organization. They're very much predicated on that unique culture of that given organization. Having official goals also enhance the legitimacy of the organization, both externally as well as internally. By having these official goals that are worthwhile, that are worthy of pursuing, it establishes organizational legitimacy in the eyes of external stakeholders. And so, in the eyes of your constituents and your client groups and your budget makers, your decision makers, it makes your organization appear legitimate, that it's there for a good reason to accomplish something of substance. And then those types of long-term official goals are also very good in terms of guiding and motivating our employees. And so they will help shape the behavior of our employees. And the clearer your goal is, the more that will then shape the behaviors of those employees in your organization. If you've done work with strategic planning and goal creation before, you're probably very familiar with the acronym of SMART, that your goals and objectives should be SMART goals and objectives. The S stands for specific. Your goal should be as specific as possible so that we know when we are achieving those goals, and those specific goals will then be able to be set apart from other types of goals that are being pursued by the organization. So the S is for specific. The M in the SMART acronym is for measurable. So they should be goals where we can measure the progress toward those goals. So we can come up with measurable operational definitions of the indicators that will show us how well we're progressing toward the achievement of those goals. The A is for achievable. They should be achievable goals. They should be goals that we can actually achieve in a certain time frame. They should be relevant goals in that the goals relate back to the purpose of the organization and relate back to helping the organization achieve its stated mission in its mission statement. And the T in the SMART acronym stands for time bound, in that there are deadlines that we can attach to these goals to keep ourselves on track and making sure that we've achieved the goals that we've established for ourselves. And where some organizations have problems is they have problems with the T. They have problems with the time-bound element of the SMART goals. they have difficulty actually establishing deadlines when these goals should be accomplished. If you have open-ended goals, then it's going to be more difficult for you to have that motivation and that impetus toward achieving those goals. So typically our goals abide by that SMART type of acronym. But it's important for us to realize there are different types of goals. There are long-term official goals, and then there are more intermediate operative goals that will help us along the way to achieving our long-term official goals. Now, fortunately for us in our discussion of goals and the impact upon effectiveness, there's an entire body of literature that we can draw upon to give us some really good insights into the nature of these goals and their impact on effectiveness. We know that goals are helpful for an organization because, again, they help to express the values of the organization and share the values of the organization culturally within the organization as well as outside of the walls of the organization. We know that goals can also help orient our employees toward the mission of the organization, so everyone is on the same page in what they're trying to accomplish. We know, obviously, the literature tells us there's some benefit to having clarity to our goals. The clearer our goals are, typically, the more they can help improve efficiency and productivity. So it's good to try and clarify these goals and make them as specific as possible. So the literature talks a lot about the benefit of having very specific and very clear goals for our organizations. But the literature also shows us that there are some inherent problems with goal setting in organizations. One inherent problem is that we have multiple goals. We have long-term goals, we have short-term goals. Having multiple goals sets up the potential for goal conflict. The more goals you have, the more potential one goal will come into conflict with another goal. Sometimes it's difficult for us to parcel out what we consider to be a long-term official goal and what we consider to be a more intermediate operative goal. And there really is a blurring of the lines between what's an official goal and what's an operative goal. And so sometimes it's difficult for us to kind of get that clarity. But we do know that goals can be useful for effectiveness. It's kind of intuitive to us that we need to have clear goals as an organization. The problem in the public sector is for most public organizations, our goals are not as clear as we would hope they would be. And for public organizations, as compared to private organizations, public organizational goals tend to be much more vague and ambiguous and amorphous than what we sometimes see in the private sector. They're much more vague, they're much more intangible than in our private sector counterparts. So my question to you is, why in the public sector do our goals tend to be much more vague than what we see in the private sector? Any ideas?
Maybe we don't know how we will necessarily achieve a goal due to like budgetary concerns, or we don't know what resources we'll have to get it. So we don't want to define it too specifically, because we know things change and we might not be able to reach those goals necessarily. But we have an idea of what we want.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And linking it to funding, I think, is really appropriate. That sometimes the funding we get is restrictive funding. Sometimes we'll get unrestricted funding. But if we get restricted funding, and the way in which we define our goals, sometimes we'll wall off some of those restricted funds. And so the way in which we've defined our goal makes it impossible for us to use those restricted funds because they're restricted from certain types of expenditures. So sometimes it does behoove us that we'll have more money available to achieve this goal if we're not terribly specific about what that goal is all about. And so I think that's good to kind of link that to funding. I think that certainly is an influence that can give us these more vague and more amorphous types of goals. We think about intangibility. We talk all the time about one of the major differences between public and private sectors is that the outcomes that we are trying to achieve in the public sector, those outcomes oftentimes tend to be much more intangible than what we have over in the private sector. We always use the example of quality of life. So enhancing the quality of life of an individual, that's difficult for us to actually monetize. It's difficult for us to put quantitative operational definitions and attach those to those types of intangible goals. So it's the very nature of our goals tend to be relatively intangible as compared to in the private sector. I think sometimes having these vague, ambiguous goals sometimes gives us a little bit of wiggle room and allows us a little bit more flexibility in how we go about achieving those goals and allow us to appeal to a broader range of constituents than if our goals were very specific and very targeted. I think you also have to really look at where organizations and programs come from. One reason why we have vague goals in our organizations is because our organizations typically have very vague and ambiguous mandates that are coming out of legislative bodies. Our organizations and our programs are going to find their genesis in enabling legislation. That enabling legislation is going to come out of a legislative body. We know that there is a lot of conflict in legislative bodies, especially if you look at the way Congress is operating today, just at the federal level. You take a look at a Republican controlled House of Representatives, you take a look at a democratically controlled Senate, the margins between the two parties are razor thin in both the House as well as the Senate. And even within the Democratic caucus and the Republican conference, you see a lot of splits. You see a lot of differences, even among the caucuses and the conferences. So because you have this very even split between the parties, obviously it's difficult to pass anything through Congress today. And in order to pass a piece of legislation and get a majority of members of the House or majority of the members of the Senate to support this legislation, you typically need to keep it as vague as possible. The more specifics you put in the legislation, the less likely it is that that legislation will pass. And so when we have those vague pieces of legislation that offer vague mandates to our public organizations, that in turn makes it more difficult for our public organizations to actually develop specific goals and objectives. So I think it's kind of the nature of the system. And I think that problem is getting worse and worse as we see not only a very close split between the parties in a legislative body, but when we see the parties gravitating to ideological extremes, not to get too much into a political science discussion, but as we've seen more and more political gerrymandering at the state legislative level, we've seen the creation of more and more safe districts. The safer the districts that are created, the more the parties then gravitate in opposite directions. Democratic Party will gravitate more liberal, Republican Party will gravitate more conservative, because those members only have to worry about winning their primary because they're in a safe district. So when they get to the general election, they're pretty much guaranteed that a Republican safe district, a Republican's going to win. In a Democratic safe district, a Democrat's going to win. So as a member of Congress, your primary motivation is to get reelected. And to enhance your reelection prospects, what you're going to do is you're going to appeal to the voters in the primary, because that's where your challenges will be coming from. Well, your voters in your primary tend to be much more ideological extreme than your voters in the general election. Typically, what candidates like to do is they run to the ideological extremes for the primaries, and then when the general election rolls around, then they kind of gravitate more toward the center in terms of political ideology. And so when you've got these separations between the parties, it makes it even more difficult for you to be able to pass legislation that has any types of specifics embodied within that legislation. So I think it is just kind of a nature of the beast now we have politically in terms of the legislation process. The problem then obviously is when you have vague mandates that then result in vague goals, then those vague goals create a lot of this ambiguity, which then makes it more difficult for us to motivate our employees. Next week, we'll talk a lot about motivational theories. We'll talk about theories such as path goal theory and how important it is for leaders to clear the obstacles from the path of an employee achieving their goals. And so the better you can make this path clear between the employee and the goals that they want to achieve, the better you'll be able to motivate them to higher levels of productivity, more effectiveness, and more efficiency. Very vague goals not only have problems for motivating employees, but they also present us with challenges in terms of developing our clear performance indicators. So if our goals are vague, then our indicators of performance will be vague as well. When we have those vague performance indicators, then it makes it much more difficult for us to hold our employees accountable and responsible for the actions that they are taking on the job. It makes it difficult for us to evaluate their performance, makes it difficult for us to assign rewards based upon performance, makes it difficult for us to identify the proper training and development opportunities based upon performance evaluation results. Also makes it difficult for us to sanction discipline our employees based upon performance evaluation. And so it really does erode the effectiveness of the performance evaluation process, which is really the very heart of human resource management in any public organization. So I think what we now understand based upon the literature is that it is important for us to work as hard as we can to try and develop specific goals that are achievable, but there are a lot of obstacles in the way for organizations to be able to do that. Whenever we talk about effectiveness among organizations, especially public organizations, the primary way we define effectiveness is, are we achieving our outcomes? Are we achieving our stated goals as an organization? And that is this first model of organizational effectiveness that we're going to talk about in the second half of class tonight, the goal attainment model. Are we achieving our goals? In order to use a goal attainment model for effectiveness, there are certain assumptions that we have to meet before we're able to use that type of a model. So in order to use that model, we have to assume that organizations, number one, have goals, that organizations have developed their goals. Just reading some of the Canvas 4 essays that have been posted to this point, it appears that everyone's organization has been able to identify goals. So we assume every organization has goals. We assume that we can discover what those goals are, that the organization's not hiding those goals. The organization is telling us what their goals are that they're trying to achieve. We also have to assume that those goals are at least somewhat relatively stable, that these goals, once they are created, are going to persist until they are accomplished, and that we're not going to create a goal and then next year in strategic planning, throw that goal away and replace it with a completely different goal. So we have to assume that our goals are relatively stable. We also have to assume that organizations can take those goals and they can convert those goals into specific objective measurements. And then we can then go out there and collect data on those specific measurements, process those data, and then apply our results in a timely and appropriate manner to assess how well our organization is achieving its goals. Those are a lot of assumptions that we buy into in using the goal attainment model. My question for you is just to very quickly think about your organization. Are all these assumptions true? Does your organization have goals? Are those goals converted? Are those goals stable? Are those goals able to be converted into specific measurements? Are you able to, and does your organization collect the data necessary to measure goal attainment? Do you have all these things in your organization? And that's my question to you. Do you see all these things in your organization? Again, yeah, go ahead. Yes. So we got a yes. Anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Do we have any no's? To everyone who's dubious about their organization meeting all these prerequisites?
For me, yes, except for the effective measurements, I would say.
Okay, good. You know, I would say though, looking at I'll use Cal State Long Beach because that's where my full-time gig is at. I spent 10 years as a department chair, and I participate in a lot of the strategic planning that went on in the college as well as at the university level. I would say for the most part, it is true that we usually achieve most of these things, but where I would say we sometimes have problems is in terms of stability of goals. One of the things that I have seen is the university tends to always be planning. And the old adage of strategic planning is if you are always planning, you're never doing. You never had time to actually implement those plans. And so what we would see is we see every single year, all the department chairs and the associate deans, the deans would get together and they go off to Lake Arrowhead or Big Bear or someplace, and they would have a retreat and put together all these goals that we're going to accomplish and put together our action plans for achieving those goals. Then everyone then gets back to campus and nothing really happens. And then next year you go back on your strategic planning retreat and you replace those goals with new goals. And every year it seems like there are new goals that are created. So there's not a whole lot of stability in terms of those goals. And a lot of those goals are never actually seen all the way through the process of achievement. There's a strategic plan at Cal State Long Beach now called Beach 2030. And it's all the rage at the university. And I'm on a committee right now. We're hiring a new associate dean position. And one of the things we ask all the candidates is how much you know about the Beach 2030 strategic plan, and how can you contribute to that plan? Well, some of the goals in the Beach 2030 strategic plan basically came from one person, and that's the president of the university. And one of the goals in that plan is to see the university grow from its current enrollment of about 39,000 students to an enrollment of over 70,000 students by 2030. And you look at my calendar, I see that it's 2023, and that's not a heck of a long time to grow from 39,000 to 70,000 students. So it really does raise that question, how achievable is that goal? And then what are the positive aspects of actually being able to increase to 70,000? What are some of the negative aspects? Obviously, you're going to have to move much more online. You're going to have to create new programs. Are you able to have the time to vet those programs for fiscal viability? A lot of questions involved with those goals that were created. So I think for the most part, we probably would answer in the affirmative all these questions for most of our organizations, but here and there, I think that some of our organizations are still kind of struggling in order to meet all the prerequisites for using that goal attainment model for organizational effectiveness. Now, we know these goals will then grow out of a strategic planning process, and most of us have lived through a strategic planning process, and so there's a myriad of ways in which we can engage in strategic planning. There's not one size fits all approach. Just like in everything else in public administration, it depends upon the organization and the actors who are involved in strategic planning. We know there are some basic steps in strategic planning that most of our organizations go through. We know that you have to do some prep work for strategic planning, and that prep work usually consists of internal and external assessments of your organization. Typically before you do strategic planning, you'll do an assessment of your employees and the satisfaction of your employees. You do an assessment of how well you have achieved the goals from your previous manifestation of your strategic plan to inform the new goals that you'll be developing in this new strategic plan. If you don't have a well-defined mission statement, then it's going to be difficult for you to engage in strategic planning. And so one of the initial steps is most organizations will revisit their mission statement. My MPA program just went through reaccreditation this year, and that's one of the things that we expect all programs to do as they go through reaccreditation, is to have all their stakeholders come together and have all those stakeholders work on developing the new mission statement or making modifications to the existing mission statement. We ended up just doing a few little tweaks here and there to our mission statement because our mission statement still is pretty consistent with what it was in our last accreditation cycle. But you need to have that mission statement so you can then articulate who you are as an organization and what you exist for. What's the purpose of your organization? If you know the purpose of your organization and what you are trying to achieve, then it makes it much easier then for you to articulate your goals. In addition to a mission statement, most organizations have their vision statements, as you all know, and there's a difference between the mission and the vision statement. The mission statement is a statement of who we are as an organization, why we exist and what we do. Our vision statement is what we would like to be as an organization, where we see ourselves going as an organization. What do we aspire to? And that will then be our vision statement. So your mission statement could be to recruit and educate a diverse student body with the competencies necessary to effectively lead and manage in the public and nonprofit sector. So that's the first part of our mission statement. Our vision statement could be to become the premier graduate public affairs program in Southern California. And that's what we are aspiring to. So there is a difference between mission and vision. The establishment of goals and objectives. Sometimes people call them objectives, sometimes people call them operative goals, but your primary long-term official goals and then your intermediate goals that you will then accomplish on the way toward the accomplishment of those official goals. The question in strategic planning is always, well, how many goals should we have? How many goals do we need? And again, the correct answer is, it depends on the organization. It depends upon what your purpose is as an organization and how far you have progressed in terms of accomplishing your purpose. Typically in a lot of strategic plans for public organizations, we may have 4 or 5 official goals, long-term goals, and then we may have multiple operative goals attached to each one of those long-term official goals. What is always a very difficult thing to do is, number one, to gain agreement on what the goals should be. And then number two, to develop these operational definitions of our performance measures to know how much progress we have made toward the achievement of those goals. So you need to come up with those specific performance measures to measure the achievement of the goals. Communicating those performance measures and developing action plans is important. It's important not just to develop the action plans, but as we had talked about before, it's important to actually implement those action plans. Make people accountable, place people in responsibility, or give them responsibility for achieving different action plans. Who does what in each action plan and who is being held accountable for what type of action? Then we have to look at our programs within our organization, and maybe our specific programs will have their own goals and their own sub-goals. So we identify the goals and sub-goals for the programs within our organization as well. And then we identify strategies and resources that are necessary for our programs to achieve their goals and their sub-goals. Obviously, we're going to do this with the participation of our relevant stakeholders, both internal as well as external stakeholders. So when you're doing strategic planning, sometimes it's really attractive to just look within the organization because you can do it a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently by just looking at internal stakeholders. But you really do need to embrace those external stakeholders as well and bring them fully into the process. So we put a strategic plan together. We look outside the department, we look at our advisory board, we look at our alums, we look at obviously our students, we look at our community partners, organizations where our students go to seek out employment, our partners where we have internship and articulation agreements with those partners. We look at it, we bring in some elected officials, we bring in everyone from the external environment that has a direct impact upon the program or is directly impacted by the program. You get all that feedback, you then incorporate that feedback, roll the plan up through the organization. It moves up the organizational ladder from the program or departmental level up to the upper levels of the organization with review by agency director, approval by agency director, and then implementation and developing a tracking system for that implementation. This is part of strategic planning a lot of organizations forget about is having that tracking system. As I said before, that's one of the problems in my organization is we don't have that tracking system. We don't have people who are accountable for carrying out these action plans. If you don't have that, then again, you're always going to be planning and you're never actually going to be doing. But that's where most of our goals are going to come from this strategic planning process. The clearer we can make our goals, the better we can communicate those goals, the more productive, the more motivated our employees typically will be. Obviously, the more our employees are involved in the development of these SMART goals, the more likely they are to develop buy-in into these goals and to be supportive of the implementation of those goals as well. But when we are able to define goals as an organization and we're able to measure our progress toward those goals, we then have a pathway to assessing the effectiveness of our organization. And that pathway is what's known as the goal attainment approach to organizational effectiveness. That is by far the most common approach that we tend to use in measuring the effectiveness of our organizations. Now, that is by far the most common approach, but that is not the only approach to measuring organizational effectiveness. The goal attainment approach is oftentimes the most common approach because it's the most intuitive and it makes the most sense to us. Organizations exist for a reason, and that reason is to achieve our desired outcomes. So if we can measure the achievement of those outcomes, that is clearly going to be a measure of effectiveness. So it's a very linear, very intuitive, commonsensical way of measuring effectiveness. And it flows again directly from what we've just talked about in the first half hour in terms of developing those goals. A second way in which we can measure effectiveness, though, especially if we are not able to clearly operationalize these goals, if our goals are too vague and they're too intangible for us to actually measure, then a second approach is what's known as the systems resource approach. And here, rather than looking at the outcome that we are achieving, we're looking at the resources that we are generating. And it's a second way in which we can define organizational effectiveness. A third way we can define organizational effectiveness is what's called the participant satisfaction model of effectiveness. We look at our constituencies and our stakeholders and we measure their satisfaction levels with what the organization is doing. And we're going to go through all these in detail in a minute, and then the fourth one is what's oftentimes called the internal process model. Sometimes people will talk about it as a human resource model. It's the internal process model, where we are effective as an organization if we have well-functioning processes that are going on within the walls of the organization. That's an internal process type of orientation. So those are the four basic models of organizational effectiveness: goal attainment, systems resource, participant satisfaction, and internal process. Let's go through and look at each one of those models of organizational effectiveness, what they are and how they work, and some of their advantages versus some of their disadvantages. So you said the goal attainment model of organizational effectiveness is by far the most common model that is used, and primarily because it is the simplest approach. It is just based upon this link between our stated goals. If we're achieving our stated goals, making progress toward achieving our stated goals, then that is a measure of organizational effectiveness. The problem, obviously, is that since it is a very simple type of an approach, it doesn't really account for a lot of the complications that could occur in public organizations. It's really just looking at the output, the outcome side, but it doesn't really look at a lot of things that can kind of complicate the achievement of those outcomes and those outputs. In essence, it's a very rational type of model. It's a very linear model. So resources come into the organization. Those resources are then used and they are then translated into outputs that the organization is creating. Those outputs being created by the organization will then result in consequences or outcomes. It's kind of that David Easton system model of understanding organizations: inputs to activities to outputs to outcomes. It is, again, a very linear and kind of a one-way type of flow throughout this systems type of model. Very rational, very orderly, very linear. The problem, though, is there can be complications. Complications such as maybe we don't have a singular expression of our goals. Maybe we do have multiplicity of goals, and maybe those multiple goals do come into conflict with each other. And we have to make inherent difficult choices between accomplishing this goal versus accomplishing this goal. So it doesn't account for a lot of that goal conflict. It doesn't really account for a lot of the influences that come from a traditional, tall, hierarchical, bureaucratic organization. And I think most of us probably work in these tall, hierarchical, classical, bureaucratic organizations, and you know a lot of the complications that come from that type of organizational arrangement. Sometimes what we do is not quite as linear of a process as we would normally think it would be. Sometimes we conflate our official goals with our operative goals. And we confuse our goals with our objectives. And when we make those types of those mistakes, we confuse our different types of goals. Sometimes the goal approach is not able to parcel out which goal we're achieving, which goal we are not achieving. So the goal attainment approach works well if you have well-articulated, clear goals, and you have a good process in place whereby you can measure the achievement of those goals. But as we said, not all organizations have well-articulated goals. Not all organizations have a good, holistic, strategic planning process. So when you are not able to use a goal attainment model because you don't have clarity of goals, a second model of effectiveness is the systems resource model. The systems resource model measures effectiveness on how well organizations can obtain valued resources from their environment. And so this systems resource model of measuring effectiveness flows directly out of open systems theory. And when you took your organization theory course, and earlier on in this course, we talked about systems theory as part of our discussion of the organization theory literature. This is very much open systems theory. So the organization operates within this system in its environment. It interacts with its environment, and it will give off energy and resources into its environment, this entropy process, but it will also then acquire new resources and new energy from the environment using this term that we talked about being negative entropy. That organizations don't always just go out of existence and dissipate all their energy. They're actually able to bring new energies in from their surrounding environment. So for the systems resource approach, effectiveness is measured by the organization's ability to exploit those resources from the environment. So the ability to bring money in from the environment, the ability to bring in political support from the external environment, the ability to bring in a well-prepared, competent labor pool from the external environment. Those are all resources that can be brought into the organization. Now, admittedly, this can be somewhat difficult because sometimes you're comparing apples and oranges. And so what's the value of political support as compared to the value of a new well-qualified employees in your labor pool? Again, kind of apples and oranges, and kind of difficult for us to come up with a uniform measurement to be able to compare those different types of resources. Oftentimes, this systems resource approach tends to be done in a very longitudinal manner, in that we'll look at the organization as a point in time and look at the resources that organization has, and then we'll compare it to a later point in time and the resources that organization's been able to bring in from its environment. So it's a very much of a longitudinal type of model. So to do the systems resource approach, it's not a snapshot. It's not you're going to just say, well, what resources do we have? And that will tell us if we're being effective. You have to look at the development of those resources and the acquisition of those resources over a period of time. I'm sure you're familiar in the world of research. Anytime we do longitudinal research as compared to cross-sectional research is going to take us a lot more resources, a lot more thought, and a lot of more effort in order to collect this information over a protracted period of time. Where the systems resource approach is most useful is when other indicators are difficult to obtain or difficult to measure. So if it's difficult for us to come up with clear goals in our organization, we're probably not going to be able to use the goal attainment approach. So the systems resource approach is kind of a fallback way of measuring effectiveness. When you can't use some of the other models, you can use oftentimes the systems resource type of approach. Again, how well are we exploiting our environment to bring new resources and new energies into the organization? And that's our primary indicator of effectiveness. Now, when we talk about these 4 different models of effectiveness, just like everything else in public administration, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, in that one model may bleed across into another model. So with this systems resource approach, think, for instance, one of the resources we can bring into the organization is something like political support. Well, you're going to get political support whenever elected officials are satisfied with what you're doing as an organization. You're going to get constituent support and client group support whenever your constituents in your client groups are happy and satisfied with their interactions with the organization. So when you're talking about things like political support and then the appropriations that flow from that political support, there is a little bit of participant satisfaction model built in, because you need to keep those external constituencies happy in order to be able to get those types of resources. So it does kind of bleed over into our third model, which is the participant satisfaction model of effectiveness. Participant satisfaction model is just what it sounds like. It's an ecological model whereby we measure effectiveness based upon how satisfied our key constituencies are with the organization and the services and products they're receiving from that organization. So how well has the organization satisfied the key constituencies in their environment? Now, obviously, we have two different environments. We have the external environment, we have the internal environment. So if we're measuring the satisfaction of our key constituencies in the external environment and measuring the amount of support they then have for the organization, that's where we're kind of bleeding over into the systems resource type of model. If we're looking at our constituencies within our organization and how satisfied they are and how motivated they are, then we're starting to bleed into the internal process, because we're starting to look within the walls of the organization. And so this participant satisfaction model can kind of cross over two other models and kind of bleed over those lines. But we see organizations use this participant satisfaction approach very frequently. Cities, if you work in a city, I'm sure you're familiar with the citizen satisfaction surveys that citizens tend to send out, that cities tend to send out to their citizens, asking their citizens, are you satisfied with the level of services that you're receiving? Are you satisfied with the quality of services that you're receiving? And we can now use our government outreach apps in order to be able to do these types of surveys. Most cities do these citizen satisfaction surveys. Again, that is a measure of effectiveness through the participant satisfaction model. Sometimes you also have to be concerned in terms of keeping your partners satisfied as well in terms of the other organizations that you are working with. We know that today we work in a governance network whereby we have multiple agencies, multiple organizations that are providing similar types of goods and services. And we work in concert with those other organizations. And so it's important for you to keep those other organizations satisfied as well as your clients and your constituents. That's the participant satisfaction model. And then the fourth model is the internal process model of effectiveness. So we will measure effectiveness based upon indicators of organizational health within the organization itself. So we're going to examine those internal activities and assess effectiveness by the indicators of internal health, organizational health, and efficiency. So some of the internal process indicators we're going to use as indicators of effectiveness are things such as the culture of the organization, how strong the culture is, how much agreement there is in terms of the values and the expectations that underpin that unique organizational culture, how positive the work climate is in the organization, the amount of team spirit, or as what was called the esprit de corps among your employees. Do you have that team spirit? Everyone's working together. We're all in this together. A lot of group loyalty are other indicators of this kind of internal health within the organization. The amount of confidence, trust, and communication between workers and management, another indicator of organizational health. Where is decision-making going on within your organization? Is decision-making occurring near information sources, meaning that the people who are dealing with these issues on a daily basis have the decision-making authority over the types of things they're doing on a daily basis? Do you locate decision-making in close proximity to where the work is being done, regardless of where those people are in the organizational chart? So essentially, how well do you delegate? Do you decentralize and devolve decision-making throughout the organization? Another indicator of internal health. The sharing of relevant facts and feelings, both horizontally as well as vertically within the organization. Again, you have this free flow horizontally and vertically of information throughout the organization. What are the rewards that are provided to managers for performance growth and the development of their subordinates and for creating effective working groups? What types of rewards are there? How are those rewards being handed out? Are those rewards being given out in an equitable type of manner? When we talk about motivation next week, we'll talk about procedural justice and distributive justice and the impacts of both procedural as well as distributive justice on the feeling of fairness among members of the organization. And then how's the organization interact with itself? The interaction between the organization and all of its component parts. Whenever there are conflicts that emerge within the organization, are those conflicts then resolved in the interests of the organization? And next week, we'll talk about different stages of conflict and what different stages of conflict mean for organizational effectiveness. But again, here we are looking within our organization at the processes in our organization and using those processes as indicators of the effectiveness of the organization. So if we have satisfied employees who are very loyal to the organization, who feel that they are in the communication loop and have the decision-making authority that they need to have, and you don't have a lot of conflict going on in the organization, but when you do have conflict, it's being resolved in a productive way in the interest of the organization. Those are all indicators of effectiveness from that internal process type of orientation. We do have to recognize again that there is a human resource element to the internal process model, in that if we are keeping our employees satisfied, we're probably keeping our employees satisfied again through communicating with them, through using a considerate leadership style, through using the appropriate motivational techniques, by developing interpersonal trust. Those are the types of things that we're doing in order to enhance those indicators of the internal process model. And in doing that, we are by definition engaging in human relations and human resource management functions. And so there is a very big HRM component to the internal process way of measuring effectiveness of an organization. Well, the big so what question that we always like to ask is, okay, we have 4 different models. Well, so what? The so what is it shows us that effectiveness is multidimensional. There's not just one way of answering the question, is our organization effective? There are multiple possible ways of answering that question. Sometimes are we achieving our goals? That's why we do it. Are we bringing in the resources we need to be successful as an organization? That's another way to do it. Are we keeping our constituencies satisfied? It's another way. And then do we have these effective, supportive types of processes going on within our organization? There are some discrete indicators. Obviously, this is the big problem we oftentimes run into in measuring the effectiveness of an organization, is developing those empirical indicators of effectiveness. And so what specific discrete indicators do we look at in order to determine the effectiveness of an organization? Well, obviously, we can measure overall effectiveness by using 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those models of effectiveness that we just talked about. Obviously, productivity can be an indicator of effectiveness. How productive are we in creating the output that we want to create, the volume of the output we want to create, if we're able to measure that? Efficiency is a closely related sister term to effectiveness, but we also have to realize that efficiency, while related to effectiveness, those are 2 different terms. Being efficient while not yet being effective, in that you can create more with less, but if the quality of what you are creating is not there, then you're probably not going to be completely effective. And so comparing the quality and the quantity, sometimes those 2 things do not work in the same direction. If you're a government corporation or a government-sponsored enterprise or a private sector corporation, then maybe profit could be a very simple measure of effectiveness for your organization. Obviously, it doesn't work very well for your classic governmental organization or your classic nonprofit organization. The quality of the output. You know, we know in the organization theory literature, there was a school called quality management with Deming and Giron and others. School of quality management, the primary purpose of that school was to build quality into the products being created by the organization. And the higher quality the products being created by the organization, the more effective that organization was. So organizational effectiveness was tied directly to the quality, the outputs being created by the organization. Number of accidents that go on within an organization, that could also be a small indicator of effectiveness. The growth of the organization, how has the organization grown in terms of its resources, in terms of its employment, in terms of its duties over the years, can be an indicator of organizational effectiveness. Absenteeism, turnover, both indicators of employee job satisfaction. And so higher levels of satisfaction will lead to less absenteeism and less turnover. A lot of people are talking about employee turnover as their primary problem for their assignments in this class, a very common problem among a lot of public organizations. High levels of turnover obviously will be an indicator of a lack of effectiveness by the organization. Motivation, which we'll talk about next week, how motivate your workforce is an indicator of effectiveness. The morale of your employees, the amount of control that you have over what's going on within your organization, the amount of conflict in the organization versus the amount of cohesion among members of the organization, how flexible and how able to adapt your organization is. Obviously, if you have a challenging dynamic environment, the organization will be effective if it's able to adapt to those changes in the external environment. Strategic planning and goal setting that we talked about earlier tonight, you know, how you engage in strategic planning, how clear your goals are, indicators of effectiveness. Goal consensus, how much agreement do you have between members of your organization in terms of those goals? Do you have consensus and congruity between the organizational goals and individual employee goals? The internalization of organizational goals. Do people buy into the goals of the organization? Role and norm congruence, which gets us to organization culture. So do we have accepted roles? Do we have accepted norms among the members of the organization? The managerial skills, the interpersonal skills of managers can also contribute to or detract from organizational effectiveness. The task skills of managers can also contribute to or detract from organizational effectiveness. One thing the literature has shown us is that whenever faced with a challenging environment, and whenever there are time pressures placed upon managers, managers tend to rely more upon their experience as compared to their knowledge. When you don't have those time pressures, managers tend to rely more on their knowledge than they do their experience. And so skills become very, very important in terms of a very time-sensitive challenge from the environment. Information management communication, again, how does information flow through the organization, indicator of effectiveness. The readiness of the organization to respond to changes and to respond to challenges and crises. There are a lot of ways in which organizations can respond to a crisis. And the way in which an organization responds to a crisis can really clue us into a lot of the dysfunctions going on within that organization. The systems resource approach of the utilization of the environment, as we've talked about before. How external entities evaluate the organization, that's kind of your participant satisfaction type of an approach. Stability in the organization, stability in terms of expectations, norms, values, and goals in the organization. The value placed upon human resources will obviously lead to more participant satisfaction, as well as leading toward more effective internal processes within the organization. The amount of participation going on in the organization and shared influence, the emphasis the organization places upon training and development, and then the overall achievement emphasis. And so does the organization place an emphasis on achievement of organizational goals, as well as an emphasis placed upon achievement individually on the part of individual employees. So there are a lot of discrete indicators, and this is not the universal list of indicators of effectiveness, but these are some discrete indicators of effectiveness that we can use when looking at our organization and assessing how effective our organization is. So it goes just beyond, did we achieve our goals? And there are a lot of other things we look at in assessing the effectiveness of our organizations. But let's kind of tie all this together, these 4 different models together, by kind of looking at how they relate to each other. And one way we can look at how they relate to each other is to use this chart I have there on the screen for you. It comes from Quinn and Rohrbach, and this is what's referred to as the competing values framework. And there's actually a e-reserve reading on the competing values framework, which if you don't have a chance to read it, it's okay, but it's on there for some supplemental reading for you. But in this competing values framework, it really does compare these 4 different models of organizational effectiveness and what they value and what they are oriented toward. So if you start at the bottom right of the chart, essentially what this chart is it has a y-axis and an x-axis. So on the y-axis, you can see that at the top of the y-axis, we have flexibility. At the bottom, we have control. On the left side of the x-axis, we have an internal focus. On the right side of the x-axis, we have an external focus. So all of the models that will right of the chart will have a primarily external focus. The ones that fall to the left of the chart will have more of an internal focus. The ones that are located at the bottom of the chart will have much more of a focus on controlling activities in the organization. The ones at the top of the chart will afford much more flexibility to what goes on in the organization, what individual employees do in order to achieve effectiveness. And so I think just by comparing these 4 different models based upon whether they have an internal or an external focus, whether they favor control versus flexibility, kind of gives us a little better way in which we can compare the 4 different models to each other. So again, if you start at the bottom right of the chart, there you have what's called the rational goal, or what we call tonight the goal attainment model of effectiveness. The goal attainment model of effectiveness is focused primarily on control and to some degree has kind of an external focus, because in the external focus, you're establishing these goals, and oftentimes your goals will be to serve people outside of the organization. For most organizations, their goals look beyond the walls of the organization. You know, what are we doing for the community? What are we doing for society? So in the goal attainment model, it focuses more on control and focuses more on an external type of orientation. This is where we engage in a lot of this strategic planning and a lot of this goal setting. And our ultimate goal is to make our organizations more productive so that we are making progress toward the achievement of those goals that we established in our strategic planning process. So if you're going to measure effectiveness through the goal attainment model, you're probably going to devote a lot of your time and your attention to strategic planning and the establishment of these goals, and then attempting to try and measure your progress toward the achievement of those goals. The top right, you have what's called our systems resource. Sometimes it likens to the open systems model, but in our systems resource model, it is, again, very much of an external focus because it looks at the relationship between the organization and its external environment, but it also favors flexibility because remember, in the systems resource approach, in order to be effective, you must be able to be flexible to adapt to your environment so that you can pull in and exploit those resources that are coming in from the external environment. So you have to be very flexible and you have to be very ready for changes in the environment. And then the ultimate goals of the open system, the systems resource model, is acquiring those resources from your environment to then help your organization grow. So that's our systems resource model. Then the top left, you have the participant satisfaction model, which sometimes bleeds over into the human relations approach. The participant satisfaction model is much more of it can be internal, it can be external. And so we put it on the left side of the screen because we're saying
we're looking at the satisfaction of our employees, but it also can bleed over into the external environment as well. So depending upon which constituency group you're looking at, if you're looking at your constituencies within the organization, you're going to be more to the left of the chart. If you're looking at constituencies outside the organization, you're going to kind of bleed across that line to the right and bleed more into the open systems resource type of a model. What you're trying to develop is you're developing cohesion and morale within your employees. You're trying to get your employees and all your constituents to support the organization. You're worried about how satisfied internal and external constituents are with the organization. When we're dealing within the organization, it's very much an orientation toward human resource management, human resource development. Then our fourth model, the internal process model, oriented around control, and then obviously within internal to the organization. Here we are trying to manage communications and information in order to create stable processes within the organization. And the more stable and supportive the processes within the organization, the more effective we are as that organization. Again, I just like this chart because it kind of allows us to see how the four different models of organizational effectiveness relate to each other. Again, those lines in the chart are not hard and fast lines, in that some of those models can bleed over those lines. The participant satisfaction model can kind of bleed over into the systems resource model if you're dealing with primarily external constituents. The participant satisfaction model can kind of bleed down over that x-axis as well into the internal process model when you are dealing with individual employees within the organization. Again, I think it just kind of gives you kind of a little bit of a visual depiction of how these four different models of organizational effectiveness relate to each other, how they are similar, as well as how they differ from each other. I think it's very useful for us to have those four different models because, again, it gives us this indication of the multiplicity of definitions of effectiveness. That's just not are we achieving our goals, but there are other ways that we can measure effectiveness in our organizations as well. So one of the things I want you to think about as you do Canvas essay number 5 is to think about your organization and think about which of these models of organizational effectiveness your organization uses. Again, it may not just be one, it may be a combination of these models together in kind of a hybrid approach. But which of these models do you see most oftentimes used as the definition of effectiveness within your given organization? But we also have to recognize that as organizations, we are not out there working solo. We're not out there working by ourselves, that we are actually existing within a network of other organizations. And this idea of governing networks is a very big part of the public administration literature, especially over the past several years. Jack Meek, who is someone who is local to Southern California. I think he's retired now, but actually used to be a faculty member at the University of Laverne. Very well known for his work in these governing networks. These governing networks are structures of interdependence between multiple organizations or parts thereof, where one unit is not merely the subordinate of the others in some hierarchical arrangement, meaning that they are working together to carry out these programs and to accomplish these goals and these objectives. Most organizations, they are working in these governing networks. And so when you think about the environment of the organization, when you think about defining the goals of the organization, you need to think about how the goals of this organization relate to the goals of the other organizations within your governing network. And so defining goals and defining effectiveness has become much more complex today because of the existence of all these governing networks. Another way we can look at our organizations, and we'll take a break after this slide, but another way that we can look at organizations is in terms of the way in which they interact with their environment. So very similar to that systems resource type of approach. The literature has shown us that different organizations interact with their environments in different ways. Some organizations are very willing to experiment and to try new things. Those organizations, the literature refers to as your prospector organizations. Prospect organizations are willing to try out new things, to be creative, to be innovative. They're not afraid of failing. They're oftentimes younger organizations that are more dynamic and more fluid. Your more traditional type of organization, your older type of organization, is what's called a defender organization. Defender organizations tend to just try and protect their own turf. They try to just make sure they can conserve what they have accumulated currently as an organization. Those are typically your more institutionally rigid, older types of organizations. Third type of organization is called an analyzer organization. An analyzer organization is a combination of prospector and defender. So the analyzer organization, for some issues at some points in time, they're willing to experiment and try new things and really interact with their environment. At other times, they retrench and they just kind of go into the walls of the organization. They create a lot of rigidity in the organization, and they're much more of a defender type of an organization. Then the fourth type is a reactor organization. These reactor organizations tend to be dysfunctional and really don't have any strategies, discernible strategies whatsoever. I mentioned these four different types of organizations because the way in which these organizations will measure and try to achieve effectiveness will differ depending upon the type of organization it is. And prospectors will obviously define effectiveness differently than a defender organization will. And chances are a reactor organization will have no definitions of effectiveness whatsoever. Christopher, go ahead.
Would you say that more private firms kind of fall under the prospectors and typically like a local government would be more of a defender, or do you think it really varies on where they come from? I just know from my experience of being in private and public, the public sector takes a lot longer to get things approved or changed or to make a change, and therefore it kind of deters them from wanting to advance those changes. And so I guess that's where that was kind of my question was coming from.
Yeah, that's a great point, Christopher, is that I agree with you. I think that private organizations will tend to be more prospectors. Traditional government organizations oftentimes tend to be more defenders. And as you point out, there are reasons for that. You know, if you're a private corporation, you are wholly dependent upon profits. And so you must be very willing to adapt and very responsive to the wants, needs, and desires of your consumers. And so you're going to have to, by definition, be a prospector. If you're not a prospector, you're probably going to end up going out of business. Government organizations tend to be much more rigid in terms of their structure. Managers and leaders have less control over their subordinates than their private sector counterparts may have. So they do tend to be much more defenders. They have more rules and processes and procedures they need to abide by. And so they're not profit motivated. So they don't have to worry that much about getting that source of revenue in the future. And so I would agree. Most traditional government organizations are more defenders. Private sector organizations, oftentimes, especially the newer ones, tend to be much more your prospectors. Again, the importance here in the so what question here is depending upon the type of organization. And again, it could be different parts of the organization look differently. You know, you may have some departments and divisions within your organization that look much more like prospectors, whereas the overall organization has the appearance of being much more of a defender. And so you may have a combination here and making that organization more of an analyzer type of organization. But the type of organization you are will have an impact upon how you measure effectiveness. A prospector organization, trying something new could be an indicator of effectiveness, being innovative, being creative, and, you know, as they say, pushing the envelope in terms of new ideas. That could be an effective type of strategy. For a defender organization, they're probably going to be much more likely to define effectiveness as, have we kept the resources we had last year? So let's look at last year's budget. Let's look at this year's budget. Look, we got a 2% increase from last year. That's effective. You know, we're being effective in keeping what we've already accumulated as an organization. Hopefully you're not working in a reactor organization. In the past, whenever I've talked about this in this course, usually most people tend to see themselves in analyzer organizations. They see themselves in organizations where certain parts of the organization tend to be much more prospector, The overall organization, however, tends to be much more of a defender type of organization. So as you think about your organization, think about which of these 4 models of organizational effectiveness, goal attainment, systems resource, participant satisfaction, or internal process, your organization uses. And then also think about what type of organization you are in as well. Is your organization more of a prospector, more of a defender, more of an analyzer, or more of a reactor? And I see it is 7:15. I'm sorry, I haven't given you a break yet. Let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll kind of keep it a short break tonight, because then if we come back, we can then have a little bit of time left to talk about decision-making as it relates to organizational effectiveness. Also, we come back from the break, I'll also open it up for any more questions or observations on this, specifically on these 4 different models of effectiveness, and cover all that information when we come back. So let's go ahead and take about a 10-minute break. Come back at 7:25. We'll cover any questions we may have and clarifications, and then we'll spend about 20 minutes or so talking about decision-making models and what they mean for organizational effectiveness. Okay, we are back. Sorry about the short break tonight, but I want to make sure we get through all the information we need to by 8 o'clock. So a lot of information for 2 hours. The pickup on Christopher's point just before we went on break, as we said, usually governmental organizations tend to be much more defenders, whereas private organizations tend to be much more of your prospector type of organization. One thing we didn't really talk about are nonprofit organizations, so where nonprofit organizations tend to fall. And I think a lot of nonprofit organizations tend to fall in that prospector category because they don't have the same limitations and constraints and restrictions that governmental organizations have. So we oftentimes tend to see them as prospector organizations. I do think in your larger, your older nonprofit organizations that are very much dependent upon grant money and have limitations placed upon the grant money that they're receiving and how that money gets spent, those organizations may be more likely to be kind of your analyzer organizations, where the programs that are funded from the restrictive funding, you have less ability to be creative and to be more innovative than in carrying out programs that are coming from more unrestricted funds. And so I think that funding source really has an impact upon what type of organization that nonprofit organization is going to be. But I just want to add that in because we hadn't really mentioned nonprofit organizations yet. Any questions or clarifications on especially the 4 different models of organizational effectiveness, the goal attainment, systems resource, participant satisfaction, and internal process models? Okay. If not, then in the time we have left tonight, I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about decision-making in organizations and what impact decision-making has on the effectiveness of an organization. Now, the type of decision-making model an organization will use will depend upon the situation the organization finds itself in, but also will be influenced by the culture of that organization as well. So if you have a prospector organization where the culture is really oriented around rewarding people for being creative and being innovative and trying new things, then you're probably going to take a more rational, comprehensive approach to how you make your decisions. If you're in an organization that's much more of a defender type of organization, that's much more reactive, that defender organization is probably then going to be a little bit more incremental in terms of its decision-making. If you're in an analyzer type of organization, you're probably going to combine rational, comprehensive with incrementalism, and your decision-making is going to be much more along the lines of the third model we're going to talk about in a second, called mixed scanning. Let's take a look at 4 basic models of decision-making and what those models of decision-making mean for organizational effectiveness. Now, some of these models, again, I'm sure you've run into before in this program, probably even before you came into this MPA program. So you're probably familiar with at least 2 or 3 of these models. But the first model I think everyone is familiar with is the rational comprehensive decision-making model. In the rational comprehensive decision-making model, when we make decisions, we do it in a very linear and very comprehensive fashion. So we're going to make a decision. we will first clearly identify all the goals that we are trying to accomplish. So it fits really well with the goal attainment type of model. We clearly identify our goals, and we clearly identify all of the alternatives that will help us achieve those goals. In order to clearly identify all the alternatives to help us achieve our goals, we're going to go out there and collect all the information that is possible to collect. We're going to go out there and get all the information, use all that information to put together a full range of alternatives that will help us achieve that goal, full range of strategies that will help us achieve our goal. Since we put together a full range of strategies, we will then select the best strategy, and then we will implement that strategy because that gives us the highest likelihood of achieving our goal. And we'll then implement that strategy. In a rational, comprehensive type of approach, again, we're going to get all the information that's out there, analyze it, use it to then come up with the strategy, select the best strategy, and then that's a strategy that we implement to help us achieve our goals. The advantages, obviously, of rational, comprehensive type of decision-making is that we are using all the information that's out there. So we're going to put together the full range of different strategies to accomplish our goal, which then allows us to select the best strategy and then implement that best strategy. The obvious problem with rational, comprehensive decision-making is what? What's the big limitation with rational, comprehensive?
It takes a long time.
Yeah, Tiffany, you're right. It takes a very long time, takes a lot of resources, takes a whole lot of effort. And even if we put all the effort we possibly can put into collecting all this information, we're still going to be limited in the amount of information that we can access, in the amount of information that we can digest and assimilate. The problem with rational, comprehensive decision-making is that we are human beings. And as human beings, we have time limitations, and we also have cognitive limitations as well. What Herbert Simon refers to as bounded rationality. Bounded rationality. That there are boundaries, there are limitations on just how rational we can be as human beings. We have these cognitive types of limitations. So it's really not possible for us to go out there and collect all the possible information. We just don't have the time or the ability as human beings to do that. If we cannot collect all the information, we're not going to be able to put together a full range of strategies. If we don't put together a full range of strategies, we can never definitively say we are selecting the best one. Because there could be strategies out there that we have not even thought of. And so if we haven't thought of those strategies, obviously we're not going to be able to select that to try and address achievement of our goal. So oftentimes it's difficult as human beings for us to be purely rational, comprehensive in how we make our decisions. So the second model is incrementalism. I'm sure you have dealt with incrementalism before. Incrementalism coming from primarily Charles Lindblom, and Charles Lindblom wrote an article where he talked about how decisions were made in public organizations. And he basically said, primarily decisions are made incrementally. And that instead of collecting all the information and selecting the best choice, we instead will collect a limited amount of information, and then we'll select the first alternative that works for us. So essentially in incrementalism, we're not able to clearly identify all of our goals and all of our strategies because our goals and our strategies are intertwined with each other. So it's difficult for us to get agreement on what our goals actually are and what our strategies actually are. We don't have the cognitive ability to go out there and collect all the information like we would under rationality. So instead, we only collect a limited amount of information. We take that limited amount of information and we use it to then develop a limited range of strategies. We then, with our limited range of strategies, will do what Lindblom refers to as successive limited comparisons. So we'll make successive limited comparisons where we will compare strategy A to strategy B, and then strategy B to strategy C, and then strategy C to strategy D, and then go back and compare A to D. and then B to D, and so on. We make all these small successive limited comparisons, and then we select the strategy that works for us in that situation. We're not guaranteeing it's the best approach. There could be a best approach out there that we've never even thought of because of our limited ability to collect the information and put together this range of different alternatives. Incrementalism, according to Charles Lindblom, that's the approach that was used and is used in most governmental organizations, just because of time and cognitive types of limitations. Lindblom gained a lot of acclaim for the article that he wrote. And when Lindblom won all these awards for the article, he said he didn't really deserve them because all he was really doing was explaining how decisions actually are being made in organizations. He said it wasn't anything earth-shattering, it wasn't anything award-worthy. It's just the way we usually make our decisions because of all the limitations we face in our governmental organizations. So incrementalism is a second decision-making model. Incrementalism is probably a decision-making model you're going to be much more likely to see in defender types of organizations because they're not going to put the effort, they're not going to put the resources into trying these new things and coming up with these innovative approaches. So incrementalism sort of carries the day in our decision-making in a lot of our governmental organizations. The advantage of incrementalism is obviously it's much quicker and it's much easier to do. You also, incrementalism, you're not going to make big mistakes. So in rational comprehensive, you may completely change the way in which you are accomplishing your goals, may completely change the way in which you are implementing your programs. That may or may not work. If that doesn't work and it falls flat on its face, then that's a big mistake you're going to be making under rationality. In incrementalism, you never really do that. So you're never going to make those big mistakes that you make in rationality. However, in incrementalism, you're going to continue to repeat the same small mistakes you've made year after year. So if you're making a small mistake, if something is not being as successful at accomplishing your goals, you're never going to go back and revisit it. You're going to just keep doing it. And so you'll just repeat small mistakes year after year. As we all know, the classic example of incremental decision-making in most government organizations is budgeting. Budgets tend to be done primarily with incremental decision-making. We take the amount of money that we spent on this expenditure last year and we add on 2 or 3 or 4%, and that's what we then spend for this upcoming fiscal year. So a lot of incrementalism used in decision-making in our governmental organizations. So rationality and incrementalism tend to exist at polar opposite ends of the spectrum. So obviously there's got to be something in between. And so what is in between is what's known as mixed scanning. Mixed scanning combines the rational approach and the incremental approach. And so if you're thinking about our 4 different types of organizations, if rationality is more common in a prospector organization, incrementalism is more common in a defender organization, then mixed scanning is what we're going to oftentimes see in more of an analyzer organization, where we kind of combine the two approaches together. In mixed scanning comes to us from an individual by the name of Amitai Etzioni. Put that in text chat. I'm going to misspell his name too, so all apologies, Dr. Etzioni, but Amitai Etzioni, I just like saying his name. Etzioni's mixed scanning combines both of the models together. Under mixed scanning, what we will do is we will use rational comprehensive or variation thereof for big decisions, and then we'll use incrementalism for smaller decisions. So when we're in our strategic planning process and we are talking about the mission of our organization, and we're talking about the official goals of our organization and the values that underpin our organization, we're going to try and be as rational as we possibly can be. For the more mundane decisions in the organization, so the amount of supplies we're going to buy for the next fiscal year, we can be much more incremental because it's not that important of a decision. So big decisions tend to be rational, smaller decisions tend to be much more incremental in nature. If you had the budgeting course, you're familiar with the idea of operating budgets and capital budgets. You know, operating budgets are primarily for the functions of an organization. Capital budgets are for these very high price tag, long lifespan capital projects. We tend to be much more incremental in making decisions for our operating budget. We tend to be much more rational in making decisions for our capital budget because these are very expensive projects, buildings, fleets of police vehicles. These are things we're going to be dealing with for many, many years. So we try and be as rational as we can possibly be. Kind of this example of combining the two together in kind of an analyzer type of an approach. The primary disadvantage with mixed scanning is that there is some subjectivity that is built into it. Now, the example I just used seemed to be a pretty clear-cut example, but we can have disagreements about what is considered to be a big item and what's considered to be a small item. What is a big item for one person may be a smaller item for someone else and vice versa. So there is a lot of subjectivity built into determining what should be done rationally and what should be done using incrementalism. When you combine them together in this mixed scanning type of approach, that's something much more along the lines of an analyzer type of an organization. The fourth decision-making model, and the one that I am most fond of, is garbage can model of decision-making. And you may have already been introduced to this in some previous courses in the program. I like garbage can model of decision-making because I think it does a pretty good job of describing how decisions are oftentimes made, especially when we're talking about decisions about policies and programs. When we make a decision about what policies and what programs to pursue, you can oftentimes see vestiges of this thing called garbage can model of decision-making. Now, I love garbage can model decision-making, but I hate the title of it. I think garbage can model is probably not the best title because you think garbage can, you think we throw everything into a garbage can and they just mix it all up and reach in and what you get is what you get. That's not really what garbage can model decision-making is. It's a much more strategic approach to making decisions. So in garbage can model decision-making, decisions tend to be made by organizations at the confluence of what's called 4 different streams. So you have what's called a participant stream, a problem stream, a solution stream, and a choice opportunity stream. The participant stream means that we have the right decision makers in place who are predisposed to making a big decision, to making a big change to the way in which the organization typically does its business. So if you've got the right people in place who are predisposed to making a big change, you've got the right people in what's called your participant stream. You've got the right people in place. Then you have a problem stream. The problem stream is a stream of all these different problems that an organization faces. The organization is aware of those problems, but they've all been kind of floating around for a while. In essence, what happens is the participant stream then starts to flow together with the problem stream, and the participants, the decision makers, decide a problem is important enough to be addressed, and they select that problem out of the problem stream. Then they need a solution to that problem. So then you've got your third stream, your solution stream. In the solution stream, you've got all these different possible solutions to this problem. You can have solutions that are being generated, newly generated to address the problem, or you can have solutions that have been floating around for decades and for generations. And you can reach back and take a solution from maybe the 1950s or the 1960s that was developed for a different problem and apply it to this problem that you want to try and solve today in your organization. I sometimes like to call the garbage can model decision-making the Quentin Tarantino model, in that if you like Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that oftentimes they're non-sequential and they kind of bounce around in terms of the time frame all over the place. This is a non-sequential, non-linear type of decision-making, in that solutions may actually predate the problems. I'll give you an example of that in a second. That's your solution stream. Then the fourth stream that you need is what's known as your choice opportunity stream. And the choice opportunity stream is some type of triggering event. So something happens that galvanizes opinion around the fact that we need to make a change to the way in which we are addressing this problem or this issue. So some profound event happens that makes people rethink how we are dealing with this issue. So from a policy perspective, an example that I oftentimes use is I use the example of the value jet crash in the Florida Everglades. that back in the 1990s, we had this very high profile airline disaster where we had ValueJet number 593 that crashed in the Florida Everglades and it killed well over 100 people, unfortunately. It was an airline tragedy. And the reason why the jet crashed is that there was a fire that broke out in the cargo bay of the plane. And by the time the fire was recognized by the crew, it was too late. It already burned through a lot of the electronics of the plane, and the plane was then unrecoverable because of that fire. Well, we had kind of garbage can model decision making coming together, these 4 different streams flowing together in order to give us a solution to this problem of undetected fires in the cargo bay of planes. The solution was a very simple one that had been around for many, many years, and that was the installation of smoke detectors. At that time, there was no federal regulation for smoke detectors to be installed in the cargo bay of planes. If there was a smoke detector that was in the cargo bay of that plane, it would alert the crew, chance to put the fire out and then save the flight. So we had a pre-existing solution. We did not invent smoke detectors in the 1990s for this problem. We took a pre-existing solution and we applied it to a present day problem, passed legislation requiring the installation of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. So you kind of had all these different streams that all flowed together in order to make a big change to the way in which we address that type of a problem. Another example of this is an example of welfare reform in the 1990s. From a policy perspective, we had a big change to welfare. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act was its whole name. It's going to be known as welfare reform, happened in mid-1990s. We had the right participants in place who were predisposed to making a big change to welfare policy. You had a Republican-controlled Congress, and you had kind of a centrist Democratic president that agreed on what the problem was, and they defined the problem of welfare as being kind of a self-perpetuating dependency on welfare. So they want to break that cycle of self-dependency on welfare. So they identified the problem. The solution that they used was what was called a block grant. And so they took a block grant that had been developed decades earlier for another situation and applied that block grant to welfare reform. There wasn't really much of a triggering event. It was just kind of a growing awareness that we needed to tackle the welfare problem. And so we needed to give more flexibility to states in how they reduce their welfare roles. But we have streams flowing together that then made us take a more rational approach to change the way in which we dealt with a problem. I think the garbage can model decision-making is a pretty apt decision-making model that we see in a lot of our governmental organizations. You got to have people in places of decision-making power who are predisposed to making a decision, making a change to how we approach a problem. You have to have a pretty well clarified problem that people agree upon. You then have to identify solutions to try and address that problem. And usually this is not all going to happen unless there's some type of a triggering event that causes all of these different streams to flow together. So a challenge from the external environment. So you might say, for instance, you may have an organization that is being challenged by having a reduction in its appropriations from Congress. And that's a major challenge that's facing from Congress. That is a choice opportunity. That is a triggering event that then causes the organization to be a bit more rational in the way in which it makes its decisions and kind of change course from the way it's always made decisions in the past. I think these 4 different models of decision-making are obviously important to us because the type of decision-making model used may have an impact upon how the organization defines effectiveness. And that if you are only using an incremental type of model of decision-making, then your definition of effectiveness is probably going to be very static and probably not going to change very much. If you're using a much more rational type of approach, a garbage can model decision-making approach to making your decisions, chances are you'll probably end up having larger changes to the way in which you have defined effectiveness in your organization and the ways in which you are measuring effectiveness within your organization. So based upon these 4 different decision-making models, one of the things I'd like for you to think about over the next week is think about your organization and think about what type of decision-making model you tend to see used most often in your organization. Do you tend to just make incremental decisions, doing the same thing year after year after year? Do you have an organization that is very apt to try new things, be very creative and innovative and very, very rational in how they make decisions? Do changes in decision-making only come as a result of some type of a triggering event, new leadership change, or some type of challenge from the environment? So think about which of these decision-making models you tend to see used most in your organization. Also being mindful that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some decisions can be made rationally, some decisions tend to be more incremental, some decisions you can actually identify this garbage can approach in terms of how those decisions are being made. But how we make our decisions in organizations can have obviously an impact on how we define our goals and how we measure our effectiveness in achieving those goals as an organization. So I just want to mention those 4 different models of decision-making. It's something you can think about over the next week. But again, how can you apply this to your organization? That's really the whole goal of this class, is to afford you the opportunity to take some of these theories and some of these concepts and apply them to your organization to hopefully work toward making your organization more effective in the future. Any questions on those 4 decision-making models and why we talk about them at this point? Hopefully it's all kind of fitting together pretty well for you in terms of why we talk about the models of effectiveness and why we talk about these decision-making models.
Do you believe that there's one model that's more effective than the other, or do you think it's very dependent on the organization and how it's used?
That's a great question. I think, my favorite answer to everything is it depends. And so I think it really does depend upon the situation the organization finds itself in and the people who are in decision-making positions within that organization. I think you can very well see some organizations that are rational in some respects and are incremental in other respects. I personally tend to like garbage can model decision-making a lot. I think that maybe because I'm a Quentin Tarantino fan, I kind of like that non-sequential type of approach. I think that sometimes when we get too linear in our decision-making, we tend to oversimplify things. We need to realize that a lot of things that go on in our organization are non-linear in nature. Sometimes we can have solutions that predate the problem. And so I think we need to kind of embrace that more complicated, complex way of looking at organizations. And I really do think it's very contextual in nature. But I do tend to like garbage can model decision-making a lot of the 4. Great questions. Any other questions or clarifications needed on either of these decision-making models or the 4 models of organizational effectiveness we talked about before the break? Again, our whole purpose in this class is to see how these skills and how these theories apply to effectiveness of organizations. And so this really is a kind of a forum for you to take this information and apply it to your organization. And that kind of nexus between theory and practice is really what an MPA program is all about. And that's why I like this course being a course near the end of the program, because I really think it allows you to pull a lot of these theories that you have been introduced to throughout your time in the program, pull them all together, and then apply them to your organization. And again, try and hopefully make your organization more effective in the future. Okay. If there's nothing else, we've got a couple minutes. We'll get out early, a little early tonight. Again, if you have any questions about any of the assignments, feel free to reach out to me via email. You've got Canvas number 4 that is due on July 2nd, and then all your other due dates then have to come in. All those assignments have to come in before July 11th, but just afford you a little bit more flexibility as you finish up your draft for your 698 project. Okay. All righty. Well, I hope everyone has a great Monday evening and a great week. And then we'll be back at it again next week. I know next week is July 3rd. It's the day before the 4th of July. Some people may have plans. I understand that. But as always, these sessions are being recorded. So if for some reason you're not able to attend next Monday, the recording will be made available to you so you can catch up on any of that information. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. And I'll talk to you again next Monday.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.